AITA for calling the police immediately when my sister's family broke into my new house with a stolen spare key? I honestly didn't think I'd ever have to call 911 on my own sister. If you'd asked me a year ago, I would have laughed at the idea. Now, I wish I'd done it sooner. For some context, I'm a 32-year-old woman, and after nearly 10 years of saving every extra dollar I earned, I finally bought my first house. Nothing fancy, just a small 3-bedroom home on the edge of town. To me, though, it felt like a mansion. I'd worked overtime, skipped vacations, drove the same 15-year-old car long after everyone told me to replace it, and spent years living in tiny apartments just to afford the down payment. The day I got the keys was one of the happiest days of my life. My parents came over to celebrate. A few close friends helped me move. Even my older sister, Melissa, showed up with her husband and 2 kids. At least, she acted happy for me. Looking back, I realized she'd been making comments all afternoon that I chose to ignore. She kept joking about how lucky I was to have so much extra space. She laughed about how one guest room was basically her family's vacation room now. Everyone chuckled. I did too. I thought she was kidding. She wasn't. About a week after I moved in, Melissa started dropping by without asking. The first time, I didn't mind. The second time, it felt a little rude. By the 5th unannounced visit, I finally asked her to text before coming over. She rolled her eyes and told me that family shouldn't need appointments. I politely explained that I worked from home several days a week and couldn't always have unexpected visitors. She acted offended. According to her, I was becoming too good for the family now that I owned a house. Things only became stranger after that. She repeatedly asked for a spare key. She claimed it was only for emergencies. I told her I'd already given one to my next-door neighbor, who had lived there for nearly 20 years and was home almost every day. That answer clearly upset her. She asked why I trusted a neighbor more than my own sister. I reminded her that it wasn't about trust. It was about convenience. She dropped the subject. Or at least I thought she had. A few weeks later, my parents invited everyone over for Sunday dinner. Nothing unusual happened. At one point, I noticed Melissa disappear into the hallway for a few minutes. I assumed she was helping Mom clean up. I didn't think twice about it. The following Friday, I left work early because one of my afternoon meetings had been canceled. I decided to surprise myself with a quiet afternoon at home. As I pulled into my driveway, I noticed 2 cars parked in front of my house. One of them belonged to Melissa. The other belonged to her husband. At first, I assumed something terrible had happened. Maybe there had been a plumbing leak. Maybe my neighbor had called them after not being able to reach me. I hurried to the front door. Before I could unlock it, it opened from the inside. Melissa stepped out carrying one of my serving trays. Behind her, her kids were running through my living room eating snacks from my pantry. Her husband was sitting on my couch watching television. None of them looked surprised to see me. In fact, Melissa smiled, then casually asked why I was home so early. For a few seconds, I honestly wondered if I'd walked into the wrong house. I asked one simple question. How did you get inside? She reached into her purse, smiled proudly, and held up a spare key. A key I had never given her. That's when I realized, someone hadn't just copied my key. Someone had stolen it. I asked her where she'd gotten it. She didn't hesitate. She said Mom had helped. At first, I thought she meant Mom had convinced me to make a spare and I'd somehow forgotten. Then Melissa explained it. A few weeks earlier, while everyone was at my parents' house for Sunday dinner, I'd left my keys on the kitchen counter. According to her, Mom had quietly taken them into another room. Melissa drove to a hardware store, copied the house key, and returned it before I noticed anything was missing. She told the story like it was clever. Like I was supposed to laugh. I just stared at her. She genuinely couldn't understand why I looked upset. She insisted it wasn't a big deal because she was family. Then she casually admitted they'd already used the key several times. I felt my stomach drop. Several times? She nodded. Apparently, whenever they were shopping nearby or the kids wanted to swim, they'd stop by my house. Sometimes they'd eat lunch there. Sometimes the kids watched movies in my living room. Once, they even invited another family over for a barbecue in my backyard because, in Melissa's words, the space was just sitting there. Every sentence made the situation worse. I asked why no one had ever told me. She laughed and said she didn't think I'd notice. That answer hit me harder than anything else. She hadn't forgotten to ask. She had intentionally avoided asking because she knew I might say no. I walked through my house in complete disbelief. Cabinets had been opened. Food was missing. The guest bedroom had obviously been used. There were towels hanging in the bathroom that definitely weren't there when I'd left for work that morning. My washing machine was running. My dishwasher was running. Someone had been living in my house while I was gone. I turned back toward Melissa and asked for the key. She refused. She actually slipped it back into her purse and told me she wanted to keep it in case of emergencies. I reminded her this wasn't an emergency. This was trespassing. She rolled her eyes. Her husband finally looked up from the television and joined the conversation. Instead of apologizing, he told me I was overreacting. According to him, families shared things. His exact words were that I had 3 bedrooms and only one person living there, so it wasn't like they were hurting anyone. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They honestly thought my home belonged to them simply because we shared the same last name. I told them they needed to leave. Immediately. Melissa crossed her arms. She said they weren't going anywhere until dinner because the kids were hungry. That was the moment something inside me changed. I stopped arguing. I stopped trying to explain. I quietly took my phone out of my pocket. Melissa noticed. She smirked. She asked if I was seriously going to call Mom to settle the argument. I looked her straight in the eye. Then I dialed 911. For the first time all afternoon, the smile disappeared from her face. At first, she thought I was bluffing. She actually laughed. She told her husband there was no way I'd call the police over a family misunderstanding. The dispatcher answered. I gave them my address and calmly explained that people were inside my home without my permission and were refusing to leave. The moment Melissa realized I wasn't pretending, she rushed toward me. She demanded I hang up. I stepped back and finished answering the dispatcher's questions. The operator asked if anyone was threatening me. I said not yet. They asked whether the people knew they were no longer welcome in the home. I looked directly at my sister and clearly stated that they were being told to leave immediately. Melissa still refused. Instead, she grabbed the spare key from her purse and waved it in the air. She kept insisting that having a key meant she had permission to be there. I told the dispatcher exactly how she'd gotten it, by secretly copying my key without my knowledge. The dispatcher asked me to remain outside and wait for the responding officers, so I did. A few minutes later, my parents arrived. Apparently, Melissa had called them before the police got there. My mother got out of the car looking furious, not at Melissa, at me. She demanded to know why I'd involved the police instead of handling things privately. I reminded her that this stopped being private the moment someone secretly copied my house key and entered my home without permission. She tried to defend herself. She admitted she'd taken my keys that night at Sunday dinner. But she insisted she'd only done it because families should always have a spare. I asked why she hadn't simply asked me. She didn't answer. My father stood quietly behind her, looking completely shocked. It became painfully obvious that he hadn't known any of this. Then the police arrived. 2 officers walked up to the driveway and separated everyone. One officer spoke with me while the other entered the house to talk to Melissa and her husband. I explained everything from the beginning. Buying the house. Refusing to give out a spare key. Discovering them inside. Learning they'd copied my key without permission. Finding out they'd already entered my home multiple times while I was away. The officer listened without interrupting. Then he asked one simple question. Did you ever give your sister permission to copy your key or enter your house when you weren't home? I answered honestly. No. He nodded and wrote something in his notebook. A few minutes later, the second officer came back outside. He was holding my spare key in a clear evidence bag. Melissa looked furious. She insisted the police were treating her like a criminal. One of the officers calmly replied that entering someone else's home without permission using a copied key could, in fact, be treated as a criminal matter. Her husband immediately changed his tone. Just minutes earlier, he'd been calling me dramatic. Now he was apologizing. He claimed they'd misunderstood the situation. He insisted they thought I wouldn't mind. The officer asked a question that neither of them could answer. If you believed she wouldn't mind, why did you copy the key without asking instead of simply requesting one? Silence. Nobody said a word, because everyone standing there already knew the answer. They hadn't asked, because they already knew what my answer would have been. The officers asked everyone to remain where they were while they finished documenting what had happened. One officer walked through the house with me. He asked me to point out anything that looked out of place. At first, I thought there wasn't much beyond the food they'd eaten and the towels they'd used. Then I opened the hallway closet. Several storage boxes had clearly been moved. When I checked my home office, the desk drawer where I kept important paperwork was slightly open. I always closed it. Always. The officer noticed it too. He asked if I stored anything valuable there. I explained that it contained financial documents, tax records, and the folder with all the paperwork from buying the house. Nothing appeared to be missing, but someone had definitely gone through it. That changed the tone of the investigation immediately. The officer began photographing every room. Meanwhile, the second officer continued questioning Melissa and her husband outside. I couldn't hear everything they said. But I did hear Melissa loudly insisting that family members didn't need permission to enter each other's homes. The officer responded with a sentence I'll never forget. Owning a key doesn't create permission. Permission comes from the homeowner. Even my mother fell silent after hearing that. Then another surprise surfaced. One of the officers asked Melissa how many times she'd entered the house. She hesitated. Her husband looked at the ground. Finally, Melissa admitted it had happened a few times. The officer asked her to be specific. After several uncomfortable moments, she quietly admitted they'd been using my house for almost 3 months. Not once, not twice, dozens of times. Sometimes while I was working. Sometimes while I was traveling. Sometimes simply because their own house was too crowded. I felt physically sick. My home had never actually felt like my home. People had been walking through it whenever they wanted, opening my refrigerator, watching television, letting their children play with my belongings, using my electricity, my water, my internet, without me ever knowing. Then the officer asked one final question. Has anyone besides your immediate family ever entered the house using that copied key? Melissa froze. She glanced at her husband. That tiny hesitation was all the officer needed to notice. He repeated the question. This time, her husband answered. He admitted that his younger brother had borrowed the key once while they were all nearby because he needed a place to rest before driving home. I stared at him. Then I asked if he was seriously telling me that someone I barely knew had been inside my house. He quietly nodded. That was the moment my father finally spoke. His voice was calmer than I'd ever heard it. He looked directly at my mother. Then at Melissa. He said he'd spent 30 years teaching his children that trust was something you earned. He couldn't understand how the two people closest to him had convinced themselves that secretly copying someone's house key was an act of love. Neither of them had an answer. The officers eventually returned my original key and advised me to replace every lock on the property immediately. They also suggested installing security cameras since it was impossible to know how many copies of the key existed. As Melissa climbed into her car, she turned back toward me one last time. Instead of apologizing, she said I had embarrassed the family over nothing. I watched her drive away. For the first time all day. I wasn't angry anymore. I was simply relieved that I'd called the police before convincing myself to let it slide. Because if someone believes they're entitled to your home today, there's no telling what they'll believe they're entitled to tomorrow. The next morning, I replaced every lock in the house, not just the front door, every single exterior lock. I also installed a video doorbell, security cameras around the property, and a smart lock that recorded every time someone entered. It wasn't cheap. But after realizing strangers had been walking through my home for months without my knowledge, it felt like the only way I'd ever sleep peacefully again. A week later, my parents asked to meet. My father spoke first. He apologized for not seeing what had been happening. He admitted he'd had no idea my mother had helped Melissa copy my key. He also confessed something that made everything click. This wasn't the first time. Apparently, my mother had always believed that family doesn't need boundaries. Growing up, she'd regularly borrowed things from relatives without asking. She'd given away other people's belongings because she thought they'd understand. Most relatives had simply stayed quiet to avoid arguments. Melissa had grown up watching that behavior. To her, it was normal. That explanation helped me understand where it came from. It didn't excuse it. My mother apologized too. For the first time, it wasn't followed by an explanation or a justification. She admitted she'd confused access with trust. She believed that because we were family, permission was automatic. She finally understood that trust isn't proven by taking someone's boundaries away. It's proven by respecting them. Melissa never apologized. Instead, she spent weeks telling relatives that I'd had her arrested. The truth was much less dramatic. The officers hadn't arrested her that day. They documented the incident, took my statement, recovered the copied key, and warned her that returning to my property without permission could lead to criminal charges. Most of the family eventually learned what had actually happened. Several relatives quietly admitted something surprising. Melissa had done similar things to them before. Borrowing cars without asking. Using vacation homes she hadn't been invited to. Helping herself to spare keys because she assumed she'd be welcome. No one had ever reported it. Everyone had simply tolerated it. Until now. Months passed. No one showed up at my house unexpectedly anymore. Not because they suddenly agreed with my decision. Because they knew the boundaries were finally real. Last Christmas, my parents hosted dinner again. For the first time in years, my mother asked before entering my home to help carry gifts inside. It was such a simple question. Is it okay if I come in? I smiled and said yes, because now it was my choice. Looking back, some people still ask if I overreacted by calling the police immediately. I don't think I did. If I'd waited, the copied key might have disappeared. The story could have become my word against theirs. Instead, the officers arrived while they were still inside my home, using a key they had never been given permission to make. There was no confusion, only facts. Buying my first house was supposed to teach me about mortgages, maintenance, and property taxes. Instead, it taught me something much more valuable. A locked door isn't what makes a house feel safe. Respect does. And if someone has to steal a key to get into your life, they've already proven they never deserved one in the first place.